Okay, so the Holy Family, one of the very famous texts, and remember, what comes after the Holy Family is the German ideology. So here you see Marx and Engels, they're both very critical, very sarcastic, and so on, but still not quite themselves, as you will see in German, in German ideology. Instead of Herr Bruno Bauer, they call him more than a couple of times, I think, Saint Bruno Bauer. So he becomes saint because of this kind of theological mindset that Bruno Bauer has, according to Marx and Engels' charge, at least. But why theological? Because Bruno Bauer was a proud, secular, left Hegelian, like Feuerbach, who went after everything, basically. So whenever Marx mentions absolute criticism or critical critique and so on, that is not in what you read, but it also depends on the translation, I believe. So absolute criticism, that is, he is attacking sarcastically. He's using that expression to attack the left Hegelians. Why the left Hegelians? Because we already talked about how the left Hegelians were being targeted by the authorities in all German universities, especially during these times when Marx and Engels wrote The Holy Family and the German ideology, right? German idealism, right? So this, starting from 1940, left Hegelians were being targeted in all universities in Prussia. Here you have Marx and Engels going after left Hegelians, and they themselves were, in a sense, left Hegelians. Of course, they were Hegelians, and although it's a complicated story, in what sense they were Hegelian in the beginning, and then what happened, and what Marx does to Hegel's system later. So why going after these people? Well, because they say, Marx and Engels say in the text already, that these people they consider themselves dangerous critics of the German tradition and philosophy and idealism. And the Germans also consider them really dangerous. Remember, Marx and Engels say they consider themselves, so people like Bruno Bauer, Feuerbach, and so on, consider themselves the wolves. And by the way, this is being recorded, but it's only the speaker, only I will be in the picture. So feel free to turn on your video or not. So they consider themselves the wolves, very dangerous critics who supposedly subject everything to their critique. Marx and Engels go after them. We could simply today just talk about that, the meaning of that, how meaningful that is, and the implications of that, say, in today's world. To Marx and Engels, it seems what is most annoying is that there is a movement in intelligentsia that assumes, that claims protest, that claims some form of progressive, whatever you call it, antagonism, opposition, and so on, against what? Against the status quo, even within philosophy itself. And to Marx and Engels, this must be criticized very seriously. That's not to say, of course, that they by no means do they leave the rest in the whole, say, the ideological landscape, the ideological topography. The rest are also being subjected to Marx and Engels' critique. But it is very interesting to note how they are focusing on this group. They mention that all of a sudden you have these people very proudly they are subjecting, according to themselves at least, 300 years of tradition of philosophy, or at least German philosophy, to their critique. But then what happens? Now, a couple of historical notes here, very important in terms of terminology, I think, is to keep in mind the word mass, the term mass, was used in a very negative sense all the way until 19th century, until Marx comes along. In fact, Marx is the first philosopher who, on such a level, turns around the word to use it in that sense. And I think that is explained very well by Balibar and others, and a couple of Marxian historians as well. So the word mass is used, the masses, has very negative connotations. The people, the masses who can't think, the masses who are like herds, and so on and so forth. And that is actually the connotation, like herds. Marx turns that around, and you can imagine the challenge of such a move for the first time. So Marx says, yes, so if you are saying the spirit is reason, the spirit is critique, and the masses don't have that, don't have access to that reason or to the spirit, then the masses are the spiritless. On the other hand, you have Bruno Bauer, Feuerbach, this group, considering themselves basically what? The spokespeople of the spokespersons of what? Of the spirit, right? That's why Marx says, sarcastically says, history takes action through them, through Bruno Bauer, Feuerbach, and so on. Why? Because they represent the spirit. They represent reason according to their own image of themselves. So first, as you read, he tries to set the scene for what will come after. Then he will go after Bruno Bauer, Feuerbach, and so on, one by one. But the problem with Bruno Bauer, you see, we have already talked about this 2 weeks ago, how on the Jewish question, in the article on the Jewish question, Marx replies to Bruno Bauer's article called The Jewish Question. And there you already saw how Marx's problem is that Bruno Bauer is actually using a theological kind of mindset. He couldn't even question that, because he says Jews, he refers to Jews, he here being Bauer. Bauer refers to Jews as people who are being essentially defined by what? By the Holy Scripture of Judaism, right? So that means you are already thinking theologically. So I want you to please keep this in mind as we go along. Very important, because to Marx, no, what you should do, this should be elementary, he says. What you should do is you can explain perhaps Judaism through Jews, like the human, the concrete human, not vice versa. Right? You can't explain Jews through Judaism. That means you are already completely ignoring history in every sense, not only the materialist sense. And history is obviously the big word for both sides, for all the Hegelian sides, obviously, right? But for Hegel, and remember this, because we haven't read Hegel in this course, so that's why I try to refer back once in a while also to Hegel. So to Hegel, of course, history was also the most important term in terms of what, though? The realization of the spirit, of reason, right? Now, that means to Hegel, consciousness is central. So we are actors in history, but only insofar as through our historical acts, the spirit, what, realizes itself, right? Yeah, okay, so consciousness is the central word for Hegel. What is the central term for Marx then? That is a little debatable, but you could already guess, Marx being a materialist. So for Marx, one could say, yes, it is the human, so it is the human existence, because he says, remember, he says, every consciousness is a consciousness of, right? So every consciousness presupposes the existence of the concrete human, or the concrete being, the body, right? In that sense, consciousness is, in fact, it is the product of that organ, that is brain, of the body, right? Okay. Well, in that sense, we could say the central concept for Marx becomes what? Production. Because there is the human, there must be, if there's consciousness, it's not Descartes' world, a thinking being. There's a thinking being. No, that already presupposes the existence of the human being. Now, that human being, and this is very important, this is the beginning of, you will see, this is the beginning of the German idealism, right? When you start reading it, you have, in the first part, a good description of historical materialism. And you want to start understanding Marxism, you want to have a grasp of historical materialism. So what is, 1844, 1845 are really crucial for, understanding how Marxism basically starts as a philosophy. And I don't think, there are a lot of people who do those divisions, make those divisions, the younger Marx, the later Marx, the liberal Marx, the the communist Marx, and so on. I think there's a continuation. I think maybe there's some merit of that reading, but it has been exaggerated. Its significance has been exaggerated too much. Younger Marx, later Marx. In fact, I would go even further and say that we could argue that Marx is the most important, most serious. Let's be careful with the words. Most serious Democrat in the history of Western philosophy. Why? I've already, I think, mentioned one of the issues that could be used as a good reason for that argument. And that is, he is the philosopher who turns around the term mass, which is still, I said 19th century, historians say 19th century, it was used negatively. It is still used more or less negatively, right? Like even by a lot of Marxians, right? Definitely by a lot of liberals. So here you have a Marx who's actually way ahead of the liberals, even of his day, and that was the best days of liberalism as philosophy, as political liberalism. That's definitely the golden age of liberalism. But so Marx goes further. It turns around these terminologies. Someone like Bruno Bauer would be counted. Of course, Bruno Bauer would be counted as part of Republican philosophy, right? So he easily shows how Bruno Bauer falls into these contradictions, including what we just talked about. So let's go back then to the Jewish question. In the Jewish question, Jews to Bruno Bauer are essentially defined, right? They are defined beyond and above history. History doesn't matter in that sense. And Marx has a serious problem with that because, again, consciousness is a consciousness of, and it presupposes the human being. Now, so this is where I stopped. I'll continue now. The human being doesn't exist as one. And there's a big difference with let's say, limited liberalism or liberalism per se. But for Marx, that would be a problem with liberalism. So this human being is defined also like by the social relations. What is this social relations? The simply existing with other human beings. Now, that existence with other human beings means, to Marx, as you will see again, part 1, German ideology, how we, because he says, look, there are things that will never change about us, and it has always been like that. So let's talk about, he says, let's remind Germans of these premises, because it's important to do that. And this is very interesting because about 13, 14 years before that point, you have Hegel, very famous, a celebrity, giving lectures about history and telling his German students in Berlin that the Germans are basically at the peak point of, progress in history in terms of consciousness, right? In terms of abstraction and conception, philosophy, and all that. Marx says we need to remind Germans of the premises. One of those premises is the fact that we humans have always needed to eat. That needs our essential needs. And to do that, so our activities have also been kind of formed by those needs. Now, in a society, so our relationships then are also formed through how we provide and produce those needs. So these relationships then form whatever else we could think of. So what changed throughout history is the ways we produce and the ways we enter, therefore, those social relationships, and so on and so forth. So that's how then consciousness also changed from one historical era to another. For example, from the Greek and Roman civilization then to the Middle Age, because the Middle Age, Marx explains, is the history of what? Is a society of what? Of agriculture, right? Of more vast rural areas and so on, as opposed to urban cities and the implications of that. And then you have capitalism and what happens with that, and the deeper division of labor and the contradictions and the conflicts between people in the countryside and people in the cities, and so on and so forth. So all this you don't see in the Hegelian school, right and left, he says. And to Marx, therefore, this absolute criticism that is claimed by people like Bruno Bauer is actually another misconception of the world and another form of idealism. It's a continuation of idealism. Now, this, again, if we go back to the Jewish question, this there's a mention of the, the humanity and the state in political versus social. So Marx says these people, even Bruno Bauer, even when he uses the word social, it is a superficial, it doesn't mean anything, because he doesn't have a grasp of that. He doesn't have a grasp of history in terms of materialism. And here, Marx materialism, again, we have to be very careful. It is an age where everyone is kind of, every intellectual starts to take a position about evolution. Evolution, including in biology. And a lot of people made the mistake of equating Marx of one of those naive kind of materialists who just think things definitely progress in one line. But you will see Marx criticizing that teleology. Even here, Marx teleology, right? He mentions the word. He criticizes that kind of teleology. He's against it, and that is rooted in Hegel also, that teleology. He criticized it several times very powerfully, and one of those people guilty of this kind of naive teleology is actually Bruno Bauer and the left Hegelians. It is ironic that today one of the very common criticisms, supposedly, against Marx is that, Marx was a teleological thinker and he thought that whatever, these things must happen. No, he really didn't. I mean, to be fair, he didn't do that. He didn't say these things will indefinitely happen in 2021. He was not one of those people who think there is a prophet in every region, like the Maya civilization, the end of the world story, whatever. Then he was not he was against the whole story of Marxism is to be against that kind of understanding of history that assumes a position of consciousness that's outside, above, and beyond the human, the concrete human, right? So he doesn't do that. Now, later I would like also to go back to some of the excellent points you brought up in your comments on the reading. One of the things you touched upon was that teleology, and I'm glad how you are interacting with each other and so on. That way, you've already actually talked about some of those common fallacies about Marxism, which is, again, for example, teleology. And but what I wanted to mention basically for this at this point of our course is to keep in mind these few things. Otherwise, the text is I think it's very sarcastic. Keep in mind that. That's the most important thing I think to keep in mind. They are very sarcastic. They will stay sarcastic throughout. But here it is. The number of terms like the sarcastic uses of critique or absolute critique and so on. It could be overwhelming if you are not familiar with a little bit of the background. So I will just end with one last note, going back to the word mass. So, and I already started that note that if to Bruno Bauer masses are the spiritless, and they have a perception, but so to Bruno Bauer, that perception of the world is wrong. To Marx, actually, you know what, Bruno Bauer, that's precisely what you missed out. Then, in order to understand history, then we should look at the masses, we should look at what the masses think. So history is the history of the masses. And this is profound in the history of philosophy itself. if we had time and we could just go on and study other Marxists, other than Marx and Engels, you will see Walter Benjamin later, much later, of course, we're talking about 20th century, but when he writes his theses on history, just before he dies, he writes something called On the Concept of History. There he talks about, the history of the oppressed and how we should, as the oppressed, we should always assume, we should always know, we should always keep in mind that our state of being is always a state of emergency, as opposed to that idea that things are going okay, then things go bad and there's trouble and so on, then we need to go back to stability. No, our normal state of being, by virtue of being oppressed, is a state of emergency. And the main thesis in those theses on history by Benjamin is particularly this Marxist idea. The history of the oppressed, the history of the masses, the history of the silenced. Okay, so I will end there, and let's see with the discussion, maybe we'll cover some other points. I'll stop the recording now. Thank you, everyone.